My name is Jerry Flores, and the day of my ex-wife's funeral, my own son looked me in the eye and told me I had no right to be there. The shame burned deeper than any wound I'd ever carried, and yet I stayed. What happened after shocked everyone in that room, especially my son, when one sentence from the lawyer shattered his world and changed mine forever. You see, I walked into that chapel expecting nothing, but I walked out with a truth so powerful it left him screaming in disbelief. This story isn't just about inheritance. It's about dignity, betrayal, and a love that refused to die. Before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like this one. At my ex-wife's funeral, my own son told me I had no right to be there. His words rang out in that chapel louder than the organ music cutting through the hush of mourners who had gathered to honor Brianna. I froze, staring at him as if I hadn't heard correctly, but Dustin's eyes were cold and sharp. He wanted everyone to see me humiliated. I had walked into Riverside Memorial quietly, taking a seat in the back row, hoping to blend into the crowd of black suits and polished shoes. I didn't come to make a scene. I came to say goodbye to the woman I had once loved, the woman who had been my wife for 22 years. But my presence alone was enough to ignite my son's fury. Whispers spread like wildfire. That's her ex-husband. Why would he show up? Doesn't he know what he did to her? I felt every sideways glance, every raised eyebrow, as though each one was another weight pressing down on my chest. I bowed my head, not from shame, but to hide the storm raging inside me. At 65, I had grown used to carrying my burden silently, but never had I felt the sting of rejection so publicly. Dustin moved closer, his footsteps echoing down the aisle. He stood tall in his tailored suit, projecting the confidence of a man who believed he owned the room. His voice, carried deliberately loud, meant not only for me but for every ear in that chapel. You embarrassed my mother in life. Don't you dare shame her in death. I wanted to tell him I came only to honor her memory, but the words stuck in my throat. As I sat there, I thought of Brianna, not the empire-building tycoon she became, but the woman I had first seen in that red wool coat back in 1987, standing up to a diner manager with fire in her eyes. I had loved that woman. I had built a life with her, shared dreams, laughter, and heartbreak. But none of that mattered now. To Dustin, I was just a relic of failure, a man unworthy of respect. The air was so still that I could hear someone coughing nervously in the front row. A woman muttered, "He should just leave." My hands tightened against the pew. Part of me wanted to walk out to spare myself and everyone else the spectacle, but another part of me, the part that still remembered the promises Brianna and I had whispered on our wedding day, refused to move. "I came to honor her, not to fight with you," I said finally, my voice calm, though my heart pounded. Dustin sneered. "You lost the right to call yourself family years ago." His words struck like a whip, leaving no room for reconciliation. Around us, silence thickened, and I knew the eyes of 200 people were fixed on me, waiting to see if I would crumble or stand tall. I chose to remain seated. I would not give him the satisfaction. But even in that moment of humiliation, I could not imagine what was waiting for both of us only hours later, when one manila envelope would turn my son's certainty into ashes. He said I had embarrassed his mother in life, and now I was shaming her in death. Those words clung to me as Dustin turned to the congregation, his voice strong and practiced like a prosecutor delivering his closing argument. "This man," he announced, pointing directly at me, "spent 2 decades dragging down one of the brightest women this town has ever known. My mother built an empire while he hid behind excuses." The murmurs grew louder, and I felt myself shrink under the weight of judgment. People who once shook my hand at dinner parties now stared at me as though I were an intruder in my own story. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that I hadn't come here for their approval. I came because despite the wreckage of our marriage, Brianna had been the most important chapter of my life. Still hearing my son spit venom with such conviction cut deeper than any divorce decree ever had. The chapel was hushed, yet his words lingered, etched into the walls, like scars. I thought of standing up and walking out. At least then I would escape the whispers and the sneers. But as I shifted forward on the pew, I caught sight of the casket at the front of the chapel, surrounded by white lilies. My chest tightened. Leaving now would feel like abandoning her all over again. I couldn't do that. Not this time. Dustin wasn't finished. He drew himself taller, his tone rising. He has no place here. Divorce means family is severed. He chose mediocrity while my mother chose greatness. Today isn't about him. It's about honoring her legacy. A ripple of approval moved through the crowd. I heard a man behind me mutter, "About time someone said it." My cheeks flushed hot, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the floorboards tracing the grain in the wood, as if it could anchor me. I wanted to shout back that marriage isn't measured in balance sheets, that providing steady work and showing up for dinner mattered too. But I knew no one wanted to hear that truth. Success to them looked like the empire Brianna had built. Stability, loyalty, the quiet work of keeping the lights on that didn't draw applause. When I finally raised my eyes, I caught sight of a few faces softening, not with sympathy, but with discomfort. They weren't entirely convinced by Dustin's performance. Some shifted in their seats as if embarrassed by the spectacle. It gave me just enough strength to stay still to hold my ground. "I'll sit in the back," I said quietly, though my voice carried in the silence. "I won't speak. I won't cause trouble. I just want to pay my respects." Dustin's lips curled in disdain. "You don't get to decide that. You already disgraced her memory once." His tone dripped with finality. For a moment it felt as if he had won, humiliating me in front of hundreds, reducing 22 years of marriage into a single narrative of failure. But just as Dustin turned away, a tall man in a dark suit stepped forward from the side aisle. His voice was calm, but it cut through the tension with authority. "Mr. Flores," he said, looking directly at me, "your presence is required after the service. You've been named in the will." The entire room shifted. Dustin froze mid-step. The crowd's murmur changed pitch from judgment to curiosity. For the first time since I'd walked into that chapel, the balance of power tilted not in my favor yet, but no longer solely in his. Every whisper cut deeper than any knife. That's how it felt as I sat there listening to the crowd murmur after the lawyer's sudden announcement. My name spoken in that chapel seemed to ripple through the mourners like a stone dropped into still water. People who had been so eager to dismiss me now leaned forward, curious, unsettled. A woman in the pew ahead whispered, "Why would she name him?" Her companion only shook his head as if the idea were too absurd to consider. I shifted uncomfortably, heat rising in my neck. Being dragged into the spotlight was the last thing I wanted. All I had hoped for was to leave quietly, unnoticed. But now, thanks to the lawyer's statement, every eye in that room was on me again, not with scorn this time, but with suspicion. It was a different kind of humiliation, less cruel perhaps, but no less heavy. Dustin's reaction was immediate. He spun back toward me, disbelief etched across his face. Named in the will, he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "That must be some clerical mistake. There's no reason for him to be involved in any of this." He looked at the lawyer as if demanding confirmation. But the man, calm and professional, only adjusted his tie and nodded. "It is no mistake, Mr. Flores. Your father was specifically requested to attend the reading. The word father struck like a hammer. Dustin's jaw clenched, and I could see the fury burning in his eyes. He didn't want to be reminded of our bond, not here, not now. He lost that title years ago, he snapped, making sure everyone heard him. My chest ached, but I kept silent, knowing anything I said would only pour fuel on his fire. I lowered my gaze to the floor again, but the whispers grew louder. They weren't dismissing me anymore, they were speculating. Why would Brianna, who had built her empire long after we divorced, include me in her final affairs? Was it pity? Was it obligation? Or was it something else entirely? The uncertainty swirled through the crowd like smoke. A man near the back cleared his throat, breaking the silence. If she named him, then he has every right to be here, he said firmly. I didn't recognize his face, but in that moment his words felt like a lifeline. Not everyone in the room wanted to see me erased. Dustin shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The crowd was no longer entirely on his side. I sat straighter in the pew, feeling a flicker of strength return. I didn't ask for this, but I wouldn't run from it either. Dustin, however, wasn't finished. He turned back to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. Don't think this changes anything. You'll always be the failure she had to leave behind. His words were venomous, but his posture betrayed something else: uncertainty. For the first time, he didn't look completely sure of his dominance. I held his stare not with anger, but with quiet defiance. Inside, I was trembling, but I refused to let it show. Whatever was coming after the service, whatever Brianna had planned, I knew it would change the story Dustin had been telling about me for years. And though I didn't yet know the scale of it, I felt the ground beneath him begin to shift. I came to honor her, not to fight my son. That was the truth I kept repeating silently as Dustin hovered near the front, basking in sympathetic nods from his circle of admirers. My hands gripped the edge of the pew until my knuckles whitened, but I stayed seated. The casket at the front of the chapel seemed to glow under the muted light streaming through stained glass. It drew me back to memories I hadn't allowed myself to revisit in years. Brianna in her grandmother's wedding gown, whispering forever as I slid the ring onto her finger. The long nights spent balancing bills on our Maple Street kitchen table, scraping by, yet laughing over takeout dinners. The first time she handed me our newborn son, her eyes fierce with determination and love all at once. That was the Brianna I had come to honor, the woman, not the empire. Dustin couldn't see that. To him, my presence was an insult, a blemish on the carefully curated image of his mother's legacy. He wanted a funeral that resembled a shareholder meeting, polished, flawless, efficient. But grief doesn't follow agendas. It bleeds, it clings, it remembers. And my memories of Brianna were every bit as real as his. The whispers of the crowd swirled again, some voices scornful, others uncertain. Why is he here? Maybe she forgave him. No, impossible, he dragged her down. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to answer them. At 65, I had no appetite for public fights. I had already lost too much: my wife, my son, my place in their world. All I wanted was to sit quietly and say goodbye. Still, the tension refused to fade. Dustin's voice rose once more, slicing through the murmur. He doesn't belong here. He gave up that right the day he chose his comfort over her ambition. Laughter, bitter and sharp, rippled through a small cluster of mourners. My chest tightened, but I stayed still. Leaving now would mean accepting his narrative as the truth, and I wasn't ready to let go of Brianna that easily. I bowed my head and whispered so softly, only I could hear, "I'm here for you, Brianna. Not for them." My eyes burned, but I kept my composure. For all his posturing, Dustin was still my son, The boy who once clutched my hand at baseball games, who once asked me to fix his broken toys, who once looked at me with admiration instead of disdain. That boy was long gone, buried under layers of entitlement and ambition, but I couldn't completely erase the love I still felt. The organist began playing, signaling the start of the service. People shuffled into their seats, lowering their voices, their judgment suspended for the moment. As the pastor approached the podium, Dustin cast one last glare in my direction, his jaw set in iron. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. I wasn't there to fight. I wasn't there to reclaim lost status. I was there because once upon a time, Brianna and I had promised each other forever. And even though life had broken that promise, I still felt bound to it. That was why I remained seated, defiant in my silence. What I didn't know was that Brianna herself had left behind the final word. And in just a few hours, it would turn everything upside down. You lost the right to call yourself family. Dustin spat his words, slicing through the chapel like a blade. The congregation sat, frozen eyes darting between us, as if they were watching a staged performance rather than a funeral. I heard the scrape of shoes against the polished floor, nervous coughs, the shifting of programs in restless hands. Everyone was waiting for me to break. For a moment, I almost did. His accusation carried more weight than he realized. When Brianna and I divorced, I hadn't just lost a marriage. I had lost my place at the table, my role in Dustin's life, and the sense of belonging that comes with family. I lived in the shadow of that loss for 15 years. To hear him put it into words now was like reopening an old wound that never fully healed. But instead of collapsing under the weight of his scorn, I drew in a steady breath. "I'm not here to fight you," I said quietly, my voice firm enough to carry. "I came to honor her memory, that's all." The words didn't earn me sympathy, but they bought me something else, stillness. The crowd didn't erupt in defense of Dustin this time. They simply listened, the balance beginning to shift. Dustin smirked as though I had proven his point. "You're clinging to a past that doesn't exist anymore." She moved on. We moved on. And you. His voice faltered just slightly before he recovered. "You're nothing but a relic of failure." His words echoed, but then something unexpected happened. The tall man in the dark suit, the one I'd noticed earlier standing discreetly near the aisle, stepped forward. His presence commanded attention instantly. He wasn't a mourner. His expression was too measured, his posture too professional. With calm authority, he said, "Mr. Flores, please remain after the service. You've been named in Mrs. Flores's will. Your presence is required by law." The room erupted into a low hum of disbelief. Whispers surged again, but this time they weren't about my disgrace. They were about possibility. Named in the will, why would she include him after all these years? The tide of curiosity spread through the pews like wildfire. Dustin's face twisted, the smirk wiped clean. He stepped forward quickly, his voice sharp. "That can't be right. He has no claim. She wouldn't leave him anything. He hasn't been part of her life in over a decade." The man met his challenge with steady eyes. "It is not a mistake. Both of you are required at the reading later this afternoon." The shift was palpable. For the first time since stepping into the chapel, I wasn't the man everyone pitied or scorned. I was a man holding a key to something even Dustin didn't understand. Dustin leaned closer, his whisper venomous, meant only for me. "Don't think for a second this changes what you are. I'll see to it that whatever she left, you'll never keep." His confidence was cracking, but his hatred was stronger than ever. I sat back, my heart pounding, and for the first time in years, I felt the faintest stirrings of power return. I hadn't asked for this, hadn't even dreamed of it. But Brianna, stubborn, brilliant Brianna, had written me into the final chapter of her life. And whatever awaited us in that lawyer's office, I knew it would not leave Dustin unscathed. I thought the will would be a formality, maybe a debt forgiven. That's what I kept telling myself as I followed Dustin and the lawyer through the quiet streets of downtown Rock Springs. The funeral service had ended, mourners drifting away in clusters, still whispering about why I'd been summoned. Dustin walked several steps ahead of me, shoulders squared, every inch the heir apparent. He carried himself as if the world owed him what was about to happen inside that lawyer's office. I, on the other hand, felt like an imposter about to trespass in someone else's legacy. The office was a stately Victorian house, polished wood floors, shelves lined with heavy law books, and the faint smell of leather and old paper. The kind of place Brianna would have admired, imposing, dignified, a monument to success. I felt small, just stepping inside my worn suit, hanging loosely on me shoes that had seen better days scuffing against the polished floor. Dustin, of course, fit right in. The lawyer, Dan Morrison, gestured for us to sit. Dustin slid into the leather chair nearest the desk, crossing his legs with practiced elegance. I took the one slightly farther back, as if by instinct accepting the role of outsider, even in a room where I had supposedly been summoned by name. Dan adjusted his glasses, his expression composed, and began. "This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores," he said, his voice formal, each word precise. I leaned back, bracing myself, expecting nothing more than a token mention, perhaps a line forgiving some old debt, or simply naming me as a witness to Dustin's inheritance. My name had been a surprise, but my expectations remained low. Dustin, on the other hand, sat tall, his smile thin but confident. He already envisioned himself stepping into his mother's empire, controlling the wealth she had built, finally taking his place as the rightful heir. I could see it in the way his eyes gleamed with anticipation, his hands clasped tightly, as though he were already holding the keys to her kingdom. Dan cleared his throat and began reading the first provisions. "To my beloved son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein." A satisfied smirk crept across Dustin's face. The house was worth nearly $1 million, perched on the hillside with panoramic views. To him, it was just the beginning. Dan continued, his voice steady. "Additionally, I bequeath to Dustin the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate." The smirk faltered. I caught it, just the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. 500,000 was a fortune to most people, more than I had ever dreamed of holding. But for Dustin, who had grown up surrounded by wealth, it was a fraction of what he expected. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the quick flick of his eyes toward the lawyer, searching for more. He masked it quickly, nodding with forced composure. "That's generous," he said, his voice just a little too tight. But I could see the calculation beginning behind his eyes. He knew his mother's estate was worth far more. Where was the rest? And though I didn't know it yet, this was only the first crack in his certainty, a crack that was about to split wide open. Dustin sat tall, waiting to inherit millions. That's the picture I still see when I think of that office, my son in his immaculate suit, chin lifted, certain of his place in the world. Even after hearing the house and $500,000, he kept his posture sharp, his smile polite, though I could see a flicker of unease. To most men, that kind of wealth would have been life-changing. But to Dustin, it was only a down payment on the empire he believed was his by birthright. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "And the company." His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. He expected the words "controlling interest" or "sole successor" to follow the natural order of things in his mind. Dan Morrison adjusted his glasses, his voice even. The bequest to Dustin includes the following condition. His inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. The words hung in the air like smoke. Dustin blinked, momentarily thrown. Conditions. He repeated the words slowly, as if it were foreign. You mean strings attached. My mother would never put restrictions on me. She trusted me with the company. Dan remained steady. These are her exact words. The assets bequeathed to you are subject to your active employment with the company for the specified period. I watched Dustin's jaw tighten, his polished demeanor slipping. So you're saying I only get the house and the money if I stay chained to a desk for 2 years? His voice rose sharper now. That doesn't make sense. She built this business for me. Why would she doubt my commitment? I almost spoke, then almost reminded him that Brianna never built anything for anyone but herself. She had clawed her way up every contract, every client, every late-night strategy session, driven by her own will. Dustin had benefited from her success, yes, but he had never known the grind that created it. I stayed silent, though, watching the cracks widen in his perfect facade. He forced a laugh, brittle and strained. This is just legal jargon. Lawyers always add conditions, don't they? That's not the full picture. Obviously, the controlling interest in the company is coming next. He leaned back in his chair as if to reclaim his confidence, but his eyes betrayed him, darting toward Dan, searching for confirmation. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he methodically turned the page, the sound of paper against leather loud in the silence. I shifted slightly in my chair, sensing the tension rise like water in a sealed tank. Dustin was trying to keep his head above it, but I could see the panic creeping in. Dan finally spoke. I will continue with the provisions regarding the remainder of Mrs. Flores's estate. His voice was calm, but the way he glanced at me, just for a fraction of a second, sent a chill through me. Whatever was written in those next pages wasn't going to match Dustin's expectations. In fact, it was about to turn them inside out. $500,000. He tried to hide his disappointment. I saw it clearly, the tightness in his jaw, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers drummed against the leather armrest even as he forced a smile. Dustin had always been good at putting on a performance, but, as his father, I knew the signs. He was unsettled, though he wouldn't dare admit it in front of me. Dan Morrison's voice carried no inflection, just the steady rhythm of a man used to delivering news that could topple dynasties. The inheritance is contingent upon your continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions, he repeated, his tone matter of fact. Failure to remain employed or voluntarily severing your contract would void the bequest. Dustin's laugh came too quickly, brittle and sharp. 2 years. That's nothing. I've been with the company my entire career. I'll fulfill the terms and move forward as intended. His words sounded rehearsed, as if saying them out loud would make them true. But I could see the storm building behind his eyes. I kept silent, folding my hands in my lap. To me, 500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million sounded like a miracle. I lived in a modest apartment where the pipes rattled in winter, and I worried about grocery bills. But to Dustin, raised in boardrooms and luxury hotels, this wasn't a gift, it was an insult. Of course, Dustin continued, forcing himself into composure. This isn't the main estate. My mother's company, her investments, that's the real inheritance. This must just be the personal portion. He glanced sideways at me with disdain. Some of us were built to manage more than crumbs. Dan adjusted his glasses, unfazed. I will proceed. He turned another page, the paper sliding with deliberate weight. The silence between words was heavy, broken only by the faint tick of the clock on his bookshelf. My stomach tightened. I had no idea why Brianna had named me, why I was sitting in that room, but I felt the tension coil tighter with each passing second. Dustin leaned forward again, his confidence like a mask cracked, but not shattered. "Go ahead," he said, waving his hand, as if he were the one in control. "Read the rest. Let's put the formality behind us." His tone carried arrogance, but his knee bounced under the desk, betraying the anxiety he couldn't conceal. For a moment I thought about speaking, about reminding him that no one controlled this process, not even him, but I bit my tongue. The lawyer's job was to reveal the truth, not mine. Dan took a measured breath and looked directly at both of us. "The remaining provisions," he said, "slowly address the disposition of Mrs. Flores's business interests, her investment portfolio, and the majority of her estate." Dustin straightened in his chair, finally smiling again, as if the world was righting itself. "There it is," he murmured, almost triumphant. But what he didn't realize was that the next words would rip that fragile smile from his face, and nothing in his carefully constructed world would ever look the same again. He laughed bitterly. "Of course, that's just the start." Dustin's voice filled the office, bouncing off the polished wood and leather, but I could hear the edge of strain beneath his bravado. He leaned back in his chair with exaggerated ease, as if he were already celebrating. To him, the house and the money were appetizers before the main course. The real feast, the company and its millions in assets, was still waiting to be served, or so he believed. Dan Morrison kept his composure, sliding one page of the will neatly to the side. "The provisions we have reviewed so far," he said carefully, "represent only a portion of your mother's estate." His voice was steady, almost too calm, like a man holding back the weight of a storm. Dustin smirked. "Exactly. I told you. This is formality. My mother built the company for me. She made me her partner in everything that mattered. That's why I was always at her side." He flicked his cufflink with a touch of arrogance. "Let's move along to the controlling shares, shall we?" But Dan didn't turn the next page right away. He removed his glasses, cleaning them with a folded cloth, a gesture so deliberate it felt like a pause before a verdict. He looked at me briefly, then back at Dustin. "Before I continue, I must emphasize that these documents reflect Mrs. Flores's direct wishes. They were prepared under her supervision and reviewed multiple times." The air seemed to thin in that office. Dustin shifted his smirk, faltering for just a second. "Why are you saying it like that?" His tone was sharper now, less confident. "Of course she left the company to me. I'm her son. Who else would she trust?" I felt my pulse quicken. I hadn't considered that possibility, not seriously. My life had been lived far from boardrooms and corporate power. I had no reason to expect anything beyond a polite mention. But the lawyer's words, his slow, deliberate tone, unsettled me. "Please," Dustin pressed, his voice rising. "Read it. Let's stop wasting time." Dan finally replaced his glasses and turned to the next section. "The remaining provisions concern the disposition of Flores Consulting Solutions, all subsidiary entities, real estate holdings, and her securities portfolio." He paused again, letting the weight of the words settle before continuing. "This section represents the majority of her estate." Dustin exhaled, relieved. Exactly what I expected. He looked over at me, smirking again. "You see, Dad? This is where you get dismissed. She left you the courtesy of being in the room, nothing more. But his confidence was brittle like glass under strain. His knee bounced again, his fingers clenched tighter around the armrest. He wanted control, but the pause in Dan's voice had rattled him. I stayed silent, staring at the lawyer, waiting for the words that would finally shatter Dustin's illusion. Deep down, I sensed what was coming. I didn't know the numbers, didn't know the scale, but I knew Brianna. And Brianna never did anything without purpose. The office was so quiet, I could hear the clock tick. Then Dan lifted his eyes and said evenly, "However, the controlling interest of the company and the vast majority of her assets are not designated to you, Dustin." The words landed like a thunderclap. I felt like an intruder. Until Dan Morrison read her next words. That's the truth of it. For most of that meeting, I sat small in my chair, convinced I didn't belong. Then Dan's voice shifted, and suddenly the air in that office thickened, pressing down on all of us. He cleared his throat and read slowly his words, crisp, deliberate. "To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio." The room went silent. I blinked, certain I had misheard. 33 million. My breath caught in my throat. For a man who counted pennies at the grocery store, who patched shoes rather than replaced them, that number didn't even feel real. Across from me, Dustin's jaw dropped. For a brief second, he looked like a boy again, shocked, helpless, stripped of all his polish. Then the color rushed back into his face, red with fury. "What did you just say?" he barked. Dan didn't flinch. He continued reading, his voice unwavering. "I further transfer to Jerry Flores a controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including 65% ownership of all corporate entities, real estate holdings, and business assets, with an appointment as chairman of the board of directors." The words crashed over me like a tidal wave. I gripped the armrest, the room tilting around me. My ex-wife's empire, the very business that had consumed her life, the wedge that drove us apart, was now in my hands. I wanted to protest, to say it was impossible. But the lawyer's eyes told me otherwise. This was no mistake. Dustin shot out of his chair, the leather rolling back into the wall with a loud crack. "No, that's impossible. She would never do this." His voice cracked, shrill, echoing through the office. He turned to me, eyes blazing. "What did you do? How did you manipulate her?" "I didn't," I said weakly, still trying to breathe, to process the impossible. "I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. Liar. Dustin slammed his palm on the desk, scattering papers. "She hated you. She built everything in spite of you. You think you can walk in here and steal it all?" Dan raised his voice just enough to cut through Dustin's rage. "Mr. Flores, this was your mother's clear and deliberate decision. She underwent full mental competency evaluations. She knew exactly what she was doing." Dustin shook his head violently, pacing like a caged animal. "No. No, this is fraud. This is betrayal." His voice dropped to a growl. "She was supposed to leave it to me." I sat frozen, torn between shock and sorrow. I had never wanted her fortune. I hadn't even wanted her company. All I wanted was to say goodbye. But Brianna, stubborn, brilliant Brianna, had chosen me. And with that choice, she had just torn apart the son she had groomed for success. For the first time in years, the ground beneath me felt steady. For Dustin, it was crumbling fast. "To my former husband, Jerry Flores." Those words didn't just stun the room, they detonated it. The moment Dan Morrison finished reading, Dustin's composure shattered like glass under a hammer. His chair screeched against the floor as he shot to his feet, knocking it into the wall with a loud crack. His face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen since he was a boy throwing tantrums in the grocery store. Only now, at 37, his fury was sharper, more dangerous. "This is impossible," he screamed, his voice rising so high it nearly cracked. She couldn't do this." His hands balled into fists, his body trembling. He pointed at me with a finger that shook with rage. "You. What did you do? How did you trick her? How did you convince her to give everything to you?" I sat still, the words slamming into me, but I couldn't muster a reply. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't even spoken to Brianna in more than a decade. My lips parted, but no sound came. I was still struggling to breathe, still trying to wrap my mind around the absurdity of it all. $33.5 million. Controlling interest in her company. A seat at a table I had never wanted. You must have manipulated her when she was weak. Dustin went on pacing like a caged animal. You took advantage of her illness. Dan raised his hand, his voice calm but cutting. That is false. Your mother underwent comprehensive mental competency evaluations before signing this will. She was of perfectly sound mind and body. She was clear and determined in her wishes. But Dustin wouldn't hear it. No, you're lying. You're all lying. She wouldn't hand over her life's work to a washed-up power plant worker who abandoned her. She wouldn't throw me away. His voice cracked on that last word, and for the first time the anger looked less like arrogance and more like pain. I shifted in my chair, my chest heavy. "Dustin," I whispered. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know. I came here today to honor your mother, not to take from you. Don't you dare pretend to be noble now," he spat, whirling on me. His eyes burned with a hatred I hadn't thought possible from my own flesh and blood. "You don't deserve a cent of this, and I'll see to it you never touch it." His outburst filled the office, rattling the calm professionalism of the space. Dan sat steady, waiting for the storm to pass, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. I looked at my son, my boy, who once clutched my hand at Little League games, who once called me his hero, and all I saw was a man consumed by bitterness, unable to understand why his mother's last act hadn't been to crown him king. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about validation. Dustin needed her to choose him to confirm his entire life of ambition and entitlement had been worth something. Instead, she had chosen me. And that choice had broken him. His chair crashed against the wall as he screamed fraud. The sound still rings in my ears. Dustin leaned across the lawyer's desk, his palms slamming down so hard that pens and papers scattered like frightened birds. His breath came fast, ragged, his fury spilling into every corner of that office. "This is criminal," he roared. "You expect me to believe my mother would throw away everything she built on him?" He jabbed his finger toward me, his eyes wild. Dan Morrison didn't flinch. He calmly gathered the papers, stacking them with the practiced patience of a man who'd seen worse scenes in probate offices. "Your mother's instructions were clear, Mr. Flores. These documents were executed with full legal oversight and independent witnesses. Her competency evaluations leave no room for fraud." Dustin laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. Competency evaluations paid off by him, no doubt. He glared at me, his lip curling. "You think you're clever, don't you? Sitting there all quiet while you tricked her in the shadows. You think this makes you a man. You're nothing but a parasite." The words struck hard, but I forced myself not to rise. "I didn't even know she was sick," I said softly. My voice nearly drowned out by his shouting. "I had no contact with her." "I liar," he thundered, cutting me off. His fists pounded the table again, rattling the glass of water at Dan's elbow. "You'll never touch a cent of this. I'll contest it. I'll drag you through the courts until you choke on the legal fees. You don't know who you're dealing with." I met his gaze, seeing not just anger, but desperation behind it. He wasn't just furious, he was terrified. His whole life had been built on the assumption that he would inherit that his mother's empire would crown him as its rightful heir. And now that foundation was crumbling beneath him. Dustin Dan said firmly, his patience wearing thin, "You may pursue any legal action you wish. But I assure you, your mother anticipated this reaction. That's why she ensured the will's validity was ironclad. Every safeguard is in place. There is no path for contesting it successfully." Dustin's face twisted. He shook his head violently as if refusing to hear the words. "We'll see about that," he spat. "I'll find a way. I'll hire the best. I'll expose this fraud for what it is." His voice dropped lower, darker. "And when I'm done, you'll wish you'd never set foot in this office." The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. My chest ached with a mixture of sorrow and dread. This wasn't just anger anymore, it was war. My own son, the boy Brianna and I had once cradled in our arms, now looked at me like I was his mortal enemy. And in that silence, I realized something chilling. The inheritance wasn't the only thing at stake. What Brianna had left me wasn't just money or power. It was the burden of facing my son's wrath that was only just beginning to show itself. "You abandoned us, and now you steal from her memory." Dustin's voice cracked like a whip across the room. His chest heaved, his face red, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked less like a man in control and more like a boy whose world had just collapsed. Every ounce of bitterness he'd stored over the years came rushing out, venomous and raw. "You were never there for her," he snarled, stabbing a finger in my direction. "She carried the weight, she built the business, she sacrificed everything while you hid behind excuses. And now you get to sit there and pretend you deserve it all. No, you don't. You never did." I swallowed hard, the words slicing deep because part of me knew there was truth in them. I had struggled with her ambition, failed to match her drive. I had clung to stability when she demanded risk. Yes, I fell short. But the man standing before me wasn't speaking only about business or marriage. He was speaking about 15 years of pain, of feeling like his mother's chosen heir, only to have that validation ripped away. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "Maybe I wasn't the husband your mother deserved. I won't deny that. But I didn't ask for this, Dustin. I didn't scheme for it. I didn't even know she remembered me in her will." "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his voice rising higher. "You've been waiting for this moment your whole pathetic life, haven't you? To take from her one last time to humiliate me." I shook my head slowly. "No. I came today to say goodbye. That's all. I never expected this, and I never wanted to hurt you." The silence after my words stretched heavy and thick. Dustin's eyes flickered a flash of something behind the fury, pain, doubt, maybe even fear, but then it hardened again, his rage swallowing it whole. He laughed bitterly, a hollow cutting sound. "You want me to believe you're some kind of saint now, that you're just an innocent bystander who stumbled into $33 million and a company? No. You're nothing but a coward who walked away and got lucky." Dan Morrison cleared his throat, interjecting firmly. "Mr. Flores, I must remind you again, your mother's will was drafted with precision. It reflects her choices, not your father's." But Dustin ignored him, his eyes locked on mine. "You're not fit to run her company. You never even believed in it. And now you're supposed to sit in her chair, make her decisions, carry her legacy. You'll destroy everything she built." I let his words hang in the air before answering. "Maybe I don't know much about running a corporation," I admitted quietly. "But I do know the difference between serving yourself and serving others. Your mother saw that, Dustin. That's why she made this choice." His mouth twisted, fury battling with disbelief. For the first time, my calm seemed to unnerve him. He had expected me to crumble, to cower under the weight of his accusations. Instead, I sat steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. And in that moment, I saw something shift in his eyes. Rage, yes, but also fear. Fear that his mother's final judgment of him had already been written, and it wasn't the verdict he had spent his life chasing. The air was thick with decades of resentment. That's the only way I can describe it. Dustin's words had scorched the room, but now came the silence after the fire, a silence so heavy it pressed down on my chest. His glare never left me, as if his hatred alone could will the will's words out of existence. You think sitting there calm makes you righteous? He sneered, his voice low and sharp. You're pathetic. A powerless man who lucked into something he doesn't deserve. You didn't fight for her. You didn't fight for us. And now you want to act like you're some kind of chosen one. His laugh was jagged, bitter. You disgust me. I let his words wash over me without flinching. For years I had carried the weight of being seen as small, as less than. For years I'd stayed quiet while people whispered that Brianna outgrew me, that I was the dead weight she cut off. And maybe in some ways, they weren't wrong. But the man who sat in that chair now wasn't the same one who had walked away 15 years ago. I'm not pretending to be chosen, I said, finally, my voice calm, almost gentle. I'm simply honoring what your mother decided. I didn't ask for this, Dustin, but she trusted me. That's not about money or power. That's about responsibility. Responsibility? He barked, incredulous. You think you can carry responsibility? You couldn't even handle marriage. You couldn't even handle being a father. His words struck hard, like stones hurled at an old wound. But this time, instead of bleeding, I felt something different, clarity. I leaned forward slightly, steadying my gaze on his. Maybe I failed her in some ways. Maybe I failed you too. But I never abandoned you, Dustin. I was shut out. There's a difference. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw his jaw tighten, his eyes flicker with something other than anger, confusion, maybe even recognition. But he crushed it quickly, replacing it with another bitter laugh. Keep telling yourself that. It doesn't change the truth. You don't belong in her world. Dan Morrison shifted in his chair, his patience thinning. Gentlemen, he said firmly, this is not the place for a family brawl. These are Mrs. Flores's final wishes. They will be honored, regardless of how you feel about them. Dustin ignored him, his focus locked on me. You're a coward hiding behind paperwork, he spat. But I'll expose you. I'll drag your name through the mud. You'll regret ever stepping into this office. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. For once in my life, I wasn't shrinking from his anger. I wasn't apologizing for existing. You can call me whatever you want, I said quietly. But you can't rewrite what your mother decided. She made her choice, and she didn't choose you. The words hit him harder than I expected. His face twisted, his composure unraveling further. Around us, the office felt smaller, the walls closing in on the weight of his rage. Yet for the first time in decades, I realized something: I didn't need his approval anymore. And that realization was a power he could never take away from me. Dan raised a sealed envelope with Brianna's handwriting. The room seemed to freeze as he held it up, the cream-colored stationery catching the afternoon light. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even Dustin, red-faced and trembling, stopped mid-breath. The sight of her handwriting, bold and unmistakable, silenced everything. It was like hearing her voice from beyond the grave. This, Dan said firmly, is a personal message left by Mrs. Flores. She instructed me to read it only after the provisions of the will were disclosed. His voice carried a weight that pressed down on both of us. He looked first at me, then at Dustin, as if making sure we understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Dustin sneered, though his voice quivered. A letter. What could a letter possibly explain? She left me crumbs and handed everything else to him. You think words will change that? He laughed harshly, but it rang hollow, brittle like glass about to shatter. I said nothing. My throat was tight, my chest heavy. The sight of her handwriting pulled me back years. Notes left on the fridge, reminders written in looping script, birthday cards, signed with her fierce yet tender touch. I wasn't ready to hear her voice again, not like this. Dan carefully opened the envelope, sliding out several pages. The rustle of paper filled the room like thunder. He cleared his throat, then began. My dearest Jerry. The first words nearly broke me. My eyes burned, tears welling before I could stop them. Even Dustin stiffened, his breath catching. Whatever he had expected, it wasn't that. If you're hearing this, Dan continued, it means I'm gone. And you're probably sitting there confused, wondering if the world has lost its mind. I know you, Jerry. You're wearing that expression you always had when I rearranged the living room furniture, baffled, but trying to be polite. I bowed my head, the image so vivid it made my chest ache. That was Brianna, sharp, playful, unafraid to remind me of my quirks. For a moment she was alive again, sitting across from me, teasing with that half-smile I had once loved so deeply. Dustin's jaw clenched. His hands fidgeted restlessly on the armrest, knuckles white. He tried to hide it, but I saw the panic creeping in. His mother wasn't addressing him first. She wasn't crowning him the heir he expected to be. She was talking to me. Dan paused only briefly before continuing. I know this inheritance shocks you. I know you're thinking you don't deserve it. But Jerry, you do. And I'll tell you why. Dustin shot up from his chair again, unable to contain himself. Enough, he shouted. This is manipulation. She wrote that under duress. She wasn't thinking clearly, but Dan didn't stop. His voice cut through Dustin's fury with calm authority. These are her words, Mr. Flores. You may not like them, but you will hear them. The office fell silent once more. My hands trembled in my lap, my heart pounding like a drum. Whatever Brianna had written next would not just explain her decision. It would become the final verdict on everything we had lived through, loved through, and lost. My dearest Jerry. The words rolled from Dan's lips, but they were hers. I could hear her voice in every syllable. My chest tightened as though Brianna herself were sitting across from me, her dark eyes fixed on mine, her tone equal parts stubborn and tender. If you're hearing this, Dan continued, then I am gone and you're probably shaking your head, convinced there's been a mistake. You're wrong, Jerry. This was no mistake. I meant every word, every figure, every decision. I closed my eyes, the years falling away. I could see her in that red wool coat, fiery and alive, daring a diner manager to defy her. I could see her on our wedding day, whispering forever as sunlight streamed over us. And I could see her in those final years, her back to me at the dinner table as she scrolled emails, the gulf between us widening. Now across that gulf of death, her words reached me like a bridge. I never stopped loving you, Dan read. The air left my lungs, my throat burned. Dustin stiffened in his chair, shaking his head violently, whispering, No, that's not true. But Dan pressed on, his voice steady. Not during our worst fights, not during the divorce, not during these 15 years of silence. I was angry, yes. But the anger came because I loved you still, and I couldn't forgive myself for choosing ambition over us. Tears welled hot in my eyes. The office blurred. She had never said those words to me, not then, not when I needed them most. But here they were laid bare in ink undeniable. Dustin slammed his fist against the armrest. This is lies. She would never write this. His voice cracked desperation breaking through his rage. She hated him. She told me he was nothing. Dan didn't even look up. He continued reading as though Dustin's protests were background noise. Jerry, you begged me to remember what mattered. You wanted dinners at the kitchen table, camping trips, baseball games. I wanted boardrooms and contracts. You were right, and I was wrong. By the time I realized it, the damage was done. The words struck me harder than any inheritance. They weren't just absolution, they were acknowledgement. She knew. She had carried the same regrets that haunted me, and in the end, she had chosen to put them to rest with the truth. I wiped my eyes, but the tears came faster. Across from me, Dustin's fury burned hotter, but underneath it, I saw something else, a boy who had built his identity on his mother's ambition, now confronted with her confession that love, not success, had been her final truth. Dan folded the first page with careful hands and set it aside. There is more, he said, his voice calm. Much more. I sat trembling, my heart pounding. For the first time in 15 years, I felt her with me again, as if she had reached back through time to lift the burden I thought I would carry to my grave. Dustin, my brilliant boy. The words rolled out of Dan's mouth, and I watched my son flinch as if struck. His face, already flushed from anger, drained of color in an instant. He sat rigid in his chair, gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles turned white. For the first time that afternoon, he looked less like a polished executive and more like the little boy who once clung to his mother's hand at school drop-offs. My son Dan continued reading Brianna's handwriting. You are furious right now, I know. You believe I've betrayed you. You think your father has somehow manipulated me, stolen what should be yours. But listen carefully. He didn't take anything from you. I made this decision fully and freely. Dustin shook his head violently. No, she wouldn't say that. His voice was shaky, a fragile protest. But the letter pressed on, cutting deeper with every line. You are not ready for this inheritance, Dan read, his voice even. Not yet. You've lived your whole life in the shadow of my success. You've accepted the benefits without ever facing the struggle. You've never had to build something from nothing, never had to make sacrifices for stability. You know how to manage wealth, Dustin, but not how to create it. That is why I left you only enough to live comfortably. You must learn to stand on your own. The words landed like hammer blows. Dustin's jaw trembled, his breathing ragged. That's not true, he whispered, though his conviction wavered. I worked. I was her partner. His voice broke on the word. Dan continued, unwavering. I raised you to think the world owed you because I wanted to spare you the pain of struggle. But in protecting you, I failed you. You mistook privilege for purpose. You judged your father without ever understanding the strength of quiet dignity, the power of integrity. And you have carried resentment for him that was never his to bear. I felt my own chest ache hearing those words. They weren't just for him, they were for me too. Years of rejection and silence were suddenly reframed. She had seen what he became, and she blamed herself. Dustin covered his face with both hands, muffling a sound that was half sob, half growl. She doesn't mean it, he muttered, rocking slightly in his chair. She can't mean it. But Dan kept reading. Dustin, I love you. You are brilliant, capable, and full of promise. But brilliance without humility is a dangerous thing. You don't need my fortune to define you. You need to find your own. That is my final gift to you, the chance to discover who you are without my shadow guiding you. When the words ended, silence filled the room. My son sat broken, caught between anger and heartbreak. And I, sitting across from him, felt both sorrow and relief. For the first time, Brianna had spoken the truth he needed to hear, even if it crushed him to pieces. You have enough to live, but not enough to destroy yourself. When Dan read those words, the entire office seemed to shrink around us. They were Brianna's sharp and deliberate, written in her unmistakable hand. I saw Dustin recoil as if the sentence itself were a blade. His mouth opened, but no words came. For once, my son, who always had an answer, always had a speech, was struck silent. Dan's voice carried on, steady and patient. Dustin, I left you a home and money to live comfortably, but not the empire. Wealth on that scale can corrupt when it falls into untested hands. You've never had to struggle the way I did or the way your father did. Struggle builds strength. Without it, wealth becomes poison. I refuse to leave you poisoned, my son. Dustin's fists clenched, his nails digging into the leather armrest. He whispered, "She never thought that. She trusted me." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He wanted to believe it, but his mother's handwriting on those pages told another truth. I sat frozen, my hands trembling in my lap. The words weren't aimed at me, but they pierced me too. For years, I had believed Brianna blamed me for being too cautious, too simple, for not chasing wealth the way she had. Yet here she was, admitting that maybe caution, maybe simplicity wasn't weakness, but wisdom. Dan turned the page and continued. I wanted to give you a fortune, Dustin. Many times I drafted it that way, but each time I hesitated. I saw the way you dismissed your father, the way you measured people by their success, not their character. I knew then leaving you everything would not be a gift, it would be a curse. The words landed heavy in the silence. Dustin's face crumpled, fury and grief colliding. He shook his head, eyes glassy, jaw tight. She's wrong, he whispered hoarsely. She doesn't know me. But even he didn't sound convinced. Dan pressed forward. You think you lost because I gave more to your father. But you haven't lost anything. You've gained the one chance most people never get, the chance to become yourself. Not my son, not my heir, just Dustin. Build something on your own. Earn it. That will be your true inheritance. I stole a glance at him. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, sagged under the weight of her words. For the first time in years, he looked vulnerable, no polished suit, no smirk, no superiority. Just a son stripped bare before his mother's final judgment. As for me, I could hardly breathe. I hadn't expected absolution, but that's what she gave me in those same lines. She had trusted me with everything because I had never asked for it, because she knew I wouldn't let the money own me. I realized then that this inheritance was less about wealth and more about responsibility for both of us. For Dustin, the responsibility to grow. For me, the responsibility to steward what Brianna had left. And in her final act, Brianna had given us both exactly what we needed, even if neither of us wanted it. Jerry, you're inheriting more than money. Dan's voice softened as he read, but the words struck me with a force I could barely withstand. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms damp as I sat frozen in that leather chair. Brianna's letter was no longer just ink on paper. It was her voice, her presence, her final truth. You never wanted this, the letter continued. That is precisely why I trust you with it. I saw in you all those years ago a man who valued people more than power, a man who kept showing up even when no one was watching. I forgot that truth when ambition blinded me, but I never forgot you. I bowed my head, overcome. All the years I had felt small, inadequate, lesser in her world of power and prestige, she had carried a memory of me that was different, one I hadn't dared to believe still existed. Dan turned the page carefully, his tone steady. This company, this fortune, they were my armor. I used them to prove my worth to the world, but in doing so, I lost sight of what worth really meant. You always knew. You knew it was measured by character, by quiet integrity, not by the size of a bank account. I felt tears sliding down my cheeks. She was giving me not just her empire, but her confession. She was admitting what I had long suspected, but never heard from her lips, that she had built everything not only for herself, but also to prove something, to silence her own doubts. Jerry Dan read on, "I am giving you control because you will never use it to crush others. You will see the people behind the numbers. You will protect them instead of exploiting them. You will remember that wealth is a tool, not a crown. That's what this family needs. That's what this company needs. And that's what I could never admit until now." I wiped my face, trembling. Dustin sat rigid across from me, his eyes red, his fists clenched, every muscle in his body taut with rage and grief. Hearing his mother place her faith in me, not him, was a wound deeper than any financial blow. "Use this wealth for good," the letter urged. "Support the employees who carried me through hard seasons. Invest in the community that trusted me when I was nothing. Protect the people who cannot protect themselves. That is the legacy I should have built, and I am asking you to finish it for me." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. I had lived so long thinking I was the footnote in her story, the man she outgrew. Now she was asking me to be the steward of her life's work. Dan folded the page, gently setting it aside. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock. I looked down at my trembling hands, realizing she had given me not just her fortune, but her faith. And that weight was heavier than any sum of money. "This ended the moment your mother made her choice." That's what I told him, though the words didn't come until the very end. For a while, the office was nothing but silence, and the sound of Dan folding the final pages of Brianna's letter. My heart still thudded, the weight of her trust pressing against me. She had asked me to carry her legacy not for power or pride, but for people. I could hardly process it, but I knew one thing: I would not dishonor her final wish. Dustin, however, could not accept it. He sat, shaking his face, twisted, his voice breaking. "This isn't real. It can't be. She raised me for this. She promised me." His words trailed off, swallowed by grief and fury. Then he slammed his hand against the desk, rattling the glass water cup again. "You're nothing. You'll ruin everything she built. I won't let you." I looked at him, my son, my blood, and felt both sorrow and clarity. For years I had carried the shame of being inadequate in his eyes, the burden of being the man who never measured up. Now, for the first time, I realized I didn't need to prove myself to him. His mother's letter had already done that. "You can fight all you want," Dan said firmly, breaking the tension, "but this will is airtight. Your mother anticipated every possible challenge. You may contest it, but you will lose." Dustin stood abruptly, his chair nearly toppling. His breathing was ragged, his hands clenched, his shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight too heavy. He glared at me one last time, his voice low and trembling. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll see." Then he stormed out the door, slamming hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. The echo lingered, but the office felt strangely lighter without him in it. I sat in my chair, exhausted, my body trembling with the release of everything that had just happened. Dan adjusted his papers, his professionalism unbroken. "Mr. Flores, we will need to arrange meetings with the board. There are many details to handle. But for now, take this." He slid Brianna's letter across the desk. The envelope was warm from his hands. The ink faded slightly at the edges. I held it as if it were her hand one last time. I stood slowly, the floor steady beneath my feet. For 15 years, I had lived as though my story was over: a failed marriage, a distant son, a quiet life in the margins. Now, with one stroke of her pen, Brianna had rewritten my ending. Not as a man of wealth, but as a man of responsibility. As I walked out of that office, the sunlight felt different, warmer somehow. Not because of the money, not because of the company, but because I finally understood I had been seen. I had been chosen not for what I achieved, but for who I was. And that was a victory Dustin could never take away. In the end, Brianna's letter was more than an inheritance, it was a lesson. She had spent her life chasing power-building walls of wealth so high that love and family could barely reach over them. But when it mattered most, she chose differently. She reminded me, and in her own way reminded Dustin, that character matters more than credentials, that love outlasts ambition, and that true worth isn't measured by bank accounts, but by how you treat people. For Dustin, the lesson was hard, maybe unbearable. He walked out of that office furious, stripped of the validation he thought was guaranteed. But for me it was a chance at redemption, not through revenge or pride, but through quiet responsibility. I didn't win the company. I was entrusted with it. I didn't gain millions. I was asked to use them well. And that's what I want to leave with you. If you are a parent, remember this. The greatest gift you can give your children isn't money or titles. It's the values they carry when life tests them. If you are a child, don't wait until it's too late to see the love behind your parents' imperfections. Now I want to ask you, have you ever lived through something like my story? How did you handle betrayal, and what did you learn from it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening.